Hello, I'm Eric Neal, exercise physiologist at the 934th Airlift Wing, and today I'll be bringing you Nutrition 101. Course objectives for today's lesson is macronutrients, food measurements, MyFitnessPal, MyPlate, the food exchange, and the macronutrient exchange. Macronutrients. So what those are protein and carbohydrates and fat. So to start off, we'll talk about protein. It's made up of 22 amino acids. 13 amino acids are non-essential and 9 are essential. So what that means, the 13 that are non-essential are made by your body. The 9 essential amino acids aren't made by your body, so you have to eat those to get those. Animal proteins are complete proteins, so they have all 22 amino acids, while your plant proteins are incomplete proteins. So when you take two plant proteins and put them together and combine them, you end up getting a complete protein. So one popular type of incomplete plant protein would be the pea protein. So you'll find that in some protein shakes. Matter of fact, I use one of them myself because I try to stay away from any artificial sweeteners. And I found the only chocolate and vanilla protein that I've been able to find lately that doesn't have the artificial sweeteners is the IsoPure plant-based protein, which uses the pea protein. So what protein does is it builds, maintains, and repairs tissues. And it also provides a high thermic effect of food. So what that means, it's how many calories that you are burning through the digestion of the food. So with carbohydrates and fats, those are typically in the single digits, while with the protein, it runs at about 21 to 35% of what you're eating is being burned through the thermic effect of food. And then speaking of timing of protein, so there's different times of the day that you want to have protein that absorbs quickly and have protein that absorbs slowly. So right immediately after a workout, you want to have very, very fast absorption of your protein. So the best choice of protein to have immediately after a workout or even during your workout would be whey protein. Well, the casein protein is the exact opposite. So that would be best consumed at nighttime, a couple hours before going to bed, because the casein protein takes much longer to absorb. And so while you're sleeping, you're continuing to use your protein to repair your muscles. There's 4 calories of protein per gram. There's a recommended intake. There's minimums and maximums. So the minimum amount of protein that you should consume per day would be 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. The recommended maximum amount of protein is suggested as high as 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of lean body weight if you're on a hypocaloric diet. The protein should make up about 10 to 35% of your total calories consumed. So there's scenarios where 10% could be higher than 35%. For example, Michael Phelps, from what I've heard, he eats anywhere up to 12,000 calories per day. So if he was eating only 10% protein, he would still be consuming 300 grams per day at 1,200 calories of his protein. While someone that is on a low-calorie diet, say they're eating 2,000 calories at 35%, that would only be 700 calories at 175 grams. So the percentage that you take in isn't necessarily going to mean if you're on a high or low protein diet. It's just the percentage of the calories. So when we talk about carbohydrates, that's known for being the main source of energy. Matter of fact, your brain uses 130 carbohydrates per day. And we don't have those available, the brain will use ketones for energy. Your carbohydrates is your only source of energy for high intensity exercise. So if you do not have carbohydrates available for fuel, what ends up happening is if you continue at a higher intensity, your body will break down protein to be used as the fuel through a process called gluconeogenesis. And so that's taking away the protein for the repair of the muscles, which could cause a loss of muscle. So that's why it's important if you're doing high intensity exercise that you have some carbohydrates available for fuel, because the body uses fat during the low intensity exercise. The types of carbohydrates are complex and simple. So the complex carbohydrates would be your starchy, fibrous type of carbohydrates like pasta and vegetables, while the simple carbohydrates tend to be fruits and candy, anything that is sugary. Then for carbohydrates, they have what's called a glycemic index, and what that is, it's the value assigned to foods based on how slowly or quickly they raise blood glucose levels, with pure glucose being measured at a value of 100. More importantly, there's also the glycemic load. So that provides a little bit more accurate depiction. It combines the glycemic index with the amount of glucose contained in a food. So a really good example here that I could provide would be watermelon. Watermelon is a food that has a very high glycemic index. However, the glycemic load is not very high. And so what that comes down to is what you're eating is absorbing pretty fast into the bloodstream. However, there's not that many grams of carbohydrates or glucose that are being consumed within a decent amount of food. So the general measurements on the glycemic index for watermelon would range between about 72 to 80, while the glycemic load has been shown to measure around 5 to 7. Another type of carbohydrate is fiber. It's recommended to consume 14 grams per 1,000 calories per day. And the types of fiber that we consume are soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. So the soluble fiber actually does have some calories. It's generally about 2 calories per gram. And the reason why is because they are fermented in the gut, making short-chain fatty acids, which actually become food for our probiotics. So prebiotics, foods that are high in fiber, like fruits and vegetables, are food for our probiotics, which come from foods like Greek yogurt, which are good for our gut. So that fermentation into those short-chain fatty acids is where we get about 2 calories per gram from soluble fiber, while the insoluble fiber isn't absorbed and none of it accounts for any calories. So it's good to have both types of these fiber in your diet. We talk about the timing of carbohydrates. So just like with your protein, timing being important, timing is also important with carbohydrates. It's best to consume at the highest amounts before, during, and after our workouts. And the complex carbohydrates should be consumed mostly throughout the day, while we would reserve the simple carbohydrates for during and after workouts. Carbohydrates, they contain 4 calories per gram, and they should make up 45 to 65% of our total daily calories consumed. And the last macronutrient we'll be speaking about is fats. So just like with the proteins, how we had essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids, we also have essential fatty acids and non-essential fatty acids. So the essential fatty acids can't be made by the body. The omega-3 fatty acids, which is one of your essential fatty acids, prevent inflammation and heart disease. alpha-linolenic acids found in plant sources such as nuts, seeds, canola, and soybean oil, and DHA and EPA. Those are primarily found in fish. Those are essential fatty acids that are omega-3s. Omega-6 fatty acids help with the function of cells, also known as the linoleic acids, mainly found in vegetable oils. Conjugated linoleic acid, mainly found in grass-fed beef and dairy. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio should be 1:1, while most Americans consume a 16:1 ratio, which causes inflammation. The gamma-linolenic acids have been found to significantly reduce symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. So omega-6 fatty acids can be healthy, but at the same time, a great deal of our omega-6 fatty acids are found in processed foods that aren't good for us, and that's why we want to have that ratio of a 1:1 instead of a 16:1 ratio of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. I should say omega-6 to omega-3. One type of fat that's consumed is saturated fats. They should be limited to less than 10% of our total calories. We should be making very lean choices of red meat. It should be consumed rather than the high-fat choices, to allow higher intake of other saturated fats to come from choices such as coconut or butter, which contain medium-chain triglycerides, which are fats that burn fat. For monounsaturated fats, the omega-9 fatty acids, also known as oleic acid, is the most common monounsaturated fat and has been found to decrease plasma triglycerides, very low density lipoprotein, the VLDL cholesterol, inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity and metabolic health when replacing some saturated fats. So something else to add with the saturated fats and the monounsaturated fats, those two types of fats are the ones that increase testosterone. While the polyunsaturated fats, which are also a healthy source of fat, but they can suppress testosterone with increased intake. And that's likely due to a lipid peroxidation from those fats going rancid due to stability and to a lack of stability when in contact with oxygen or heat or light. Another type of polyunsaturated fat we talk about is trans fatty acids. They are unsaturated fats that act like saturated fats. They're classified as unsaturated because of their chemical structure, but are very unhealthy sources of fat that raise the LDL and lower the HDL cholesterol. Some important functions that fat helps provide would be brain development. So your omega-3 fatty acids have been found to increase brain development in infants and decrease dementia, while controlling inflammation. So the balanced omega-3 to omega-6 ratios are found to decrease inflammation. Increased testosterone, as I said earlier. The consumption of the saturated and the monounsaturated fats can increase testosterone production. So this is why I made a recommendation earlier about with the saturated fats, so we can keep them at less than 10% of our diet to keep the meats at a really, really lean choice, so that we can have room for other saturated fats like butter or coconut or eggs, so that we can take advantage of the fats that are going to help us produce more testosterone. There's a total of 9 calories of fat per gram, and it should make up about 20 to 35% of the total calories consumed. Recommendations for increasing testosterone for fat would actually be at 25 to 40% of the total daily calories. That concludes the 3 macronutrients And now what I'd like to provide you are some of the sources for each type of macronutrient that are good choices. So I'm going to start off with the proteins. So good complete proteins would be whey protein, omega-3 eggs, grass-fed beef, wild-caught seafood, skim milk, hormone-free poultry. Good choices of incomplete proteins, those ones combining of two of the listed foods, would be nuts, beans, pea protein, grains, seeds, and vegetables. Good choices of carbohydrates. We'll go ahead and start with the simple carbohydrates first, although we should limit the consumption. And the best way to consume simple carbohydrates is by choosing a high glycemic carbohydrate without a fat and fiber at post-workout. So candy, fruit juice, dried fruit, honey, and sugar are all great choices. So if you want to choose that time of the day to maybe have some sweets, the best time to do that is right after your workout. Your body wants very fast digesting carbohydrates at that time. The complex carbohydrates, good choices there would be fruits, vegetables, oats, beans, whole grains, rice, pasta, and starches. For fiber, mention beans again here, especially being the dry beans. So if you take dry beans and make them in the crock pot, that's going to be a much better choice to go with than from the can. They have so much less sodium and they have more fiber. So much better choice that way. And something else that you can do with that when you're making beans, add a little bit of no salt, it's a potassium salt to it, and baking soda. The baking soda is supposed to help prevent gas. Other sources of fiber, psyllium husk, fruits, vegetables, nuts, oats, whole grains, starches, and seeds. Some good fats to mention. We'll go ahead and start with the omega-3 fatty acids first. Salmon, mackerel, sardines, anchovies, chia seeds, walnuts, and flaxseed. For the omega-6 fatty acids, walnuts, almonds, sunflower seeds, and cashews. Good sources of monounsaturated fat would be olive oil, cashew nut oil, almond oil, avocado oil, peanut oil, canola oil, almonds, cashews, peanuts, walnuts, and natural peanut butter and almond butter. Good choices of polyunsaturated fats would be flaxseed, fish oil, and nuts. Best choices of saturated fat would be coconuts, coconut oil, butter, milk, eggs, and cheese. And the trans fatty acids, we should only consume the natural sources coming from grass-fed beef and butter, and avoid the trans fatty acids created in the industrial process known as hydrogenation, used in processed foods to increase shelf life. So now we're going to move on to measurements. This is very important to do with your food because you may be eating a lot more than you think you are. A really good example I'd like to go with is say you're eating some cashews or almonds or something like that, and you're just eating them out of the jar, not measuring them. They're such a small amount in the serving size, like a quarter of a cup. And so if you're just reaching in that jar and eating them till you're full, you might have like 4 or 5 servings, and that's going to add up to a lot of calories. So by using like a quarter of a cup measuring cup would be a great way to make sure that you're actually eating the amount that you're intending to. So you might think, oh, I'm just eating a quarter of a cup, and you don't measure it, and you end up having 4 servings, and that makes the calories add up. So another thing that you want to do is you want to read the labels for the serving sizes and the number of servings. So maybe you look at a bag of potato chips and you think, well, it's only got 200 calories, and you don't see that there's 4 servings in that bag. So don't be manipulated by that. Always read the label and how many servings is in it, and then do a measurement. So when it comes to measuring foods, some foods might be hard to measure in a measuring cup or using a teaspoon or whatever like that. So you could use a food scale and measure it in grams or in ounces. A great example of something that is good to use a food scale for would be measuring meats, because those would be very hard to measure with a measuring cup. Then we have there's a difference between liquids and solids. So if you're measuring liquids, you want to make sure you're using a liquid measuring cup, and if you're using the solids, use a solid measuring cup. And then rounded measuring spoons are also important. If you're trying to measure something with a typical teaspoon that you eat with, it's kind of hard to have that leveled off. So if you have the rounded types of measuring spoons that come in tablespoons, teaspoons, half teaspoons, quarter teaspoons, that can be really helpful for measuring things like powders or getting like almond butter or peanut butter. An even more accurate method with the almond butter and peanut butter is actually using the food scale. But both of those would actually work pretty well for something like almond butter or peanut butter. Another great tool, wish that this would have been invented a long time ago, it's called MyFitnessPal. When I was younger, I used to write down everything that I ate on a piece of paper, and that was kind of annoying to have to do. And so technology's brought us a long ways now, and so we've got MyFitnessPal, which is a tracking tool used for many purposes. You can be tracking your calories, your nutrients. Your nutrients are protein, carbohydrates, fats, water, vitamins, and minerals. And you're tracking your food. You could put foods, recipes, and meals, like design all that type of stuff in there. You can put your exercise in there, how many steps you've taken, how much water you've drank, how much sleep that you're getting. So there's so much stuff that you can use the MyFitnessPal for. Something I really like about it is a lot of the times you can just scan a barcode, and you don't have to do all the work of entering in everything for creating a food. You just got to make sure that it scans correctly, because sometimes when you scan that barcode, it doesn't put what the label says on it. So always look for that. And the same thing goes for when somebody else puts something into the database. Some people might put in the wrong calories or carbohydrates or whatever in the system incorrectly. So you might want to take a look and make sure that that's accurate before just assuming. But if it is accurate, that's much easier than having to go in and write in everything yourself. But you can do that, and it can be saved in there into your foods, and then you could use it multiple times. So very, very convenient method for tracking everything that you're doing. And tracking is really, really important for having success, because if you go into things blindly, you're probably not going to have as much success as you should, because you might be unaware of how many calories that you're burning or how many calories that you're consuming. It's kind of like just carelessly spending money and not keeping track of what your checking account's at if you're not actually tracking your food intake and your calories burned through exercise. So I definitely recommend, if you're not tracking, to start doing that. And MyFitnessPal is a great tool that you can use to do that. Many, many years ago, we had the 4 food groups, and then it became My Pyramid, and now we have what's called MyPlate. And MyPlate, if you go to their website, myplate.gov, you can learn a whole lot about nutrition, and they have calorie plans going from 1,200 to 3,200 calories, listing how much of each type of food, whether it be fruits, vegetables, or starches, meats, dairy, oils, how many to have per day for a certain calorie level. It's a great way to kind of figure out how to write your own diet. Something I do want to reveal about this, though, is if you follow the plan exactly and you don't have any like junk foods in there or anything, your calories is actually going to end up being lower than what the chart shows, because it actually has a little bit of wiggle room for some things like junk food that's not a part of those food groups. something similar to MyPlate is the food exchange. So the food exchange was created for diabetics, and instead of going by servings, what it does is it has exchanges. So the amount of grams for each macronutrient in these exchanges, when we talk about the starches, you're looking at 3 grams of protein, 15 grams of carbohydrates, and 0 to 1 grams of fat. This will typically be like 1 slice of bread normally. If you happen to use the exrx.net website, you can find a listing of all of the exchanges and how much food for each type of food falls in with these exchanges. So for the vegetables, that would be 2 grams of protein and 5 grams of carbohydrates and no fat. And a typical serving size there would be 1/2 cup. For the fruits, it's 0 grams of protein, 15 grams of carbohydrates, and 0 grams of fat. And the typical serving size for it is also 1/2 cup. So the milk is measured at 8 grams of protein, 12 grams of carbohydrates, and anywhere between 0 to 8 grams of fat per exchange. Typical serving size here would be an 8-ounce glass of milk. For the meats, they measure at 7 grams of protein, 0 grams of carbohydrates, and 0 to 13 grams of fat per exchange. They're typically measured at about 1 ounce per exchange. And then for the fats, they're measured at 0 grams of protein, 0 grams of carbohydrates, and 5 grams of fat per exchange. And the typical serving size for that would be 1 teaspoon of fat. So for the food exchange, what you end up doing is you just plug in for each meal how many exchanges per type of food that you're going to have in each meal. And the purpose of that is to try to keep the blood glucose levels stable. So a typical diet might run 75 grams of carbohydrates for 3 meals each, and 45 grams for 2 snacks. And so having those like every 3 or 4 hours was what was developed for diabetics using the food exchange system. Okay, so something that you're going to need to take into consideration when using the food exchange is you're going to come across some foods out there that don't exactly fall within, say, 5 grams of fat, or they've got like a mixture. Like, for example, maybe you have a candy bar, and that candy bar has 3 grams of protein, and let's say it has 30 grams of carbohydrates and 11 grams of fat. Okay, so what you'd end up doing here for plugging in these exchanges is, since the starch has 3 grams of protein and 15 grams of carbohydrates and 0 to 1 grams of fats, we'll go ahead and plug in 1 starch. So now we're taking care of the 3 grams of protein, 15 out of the 30 grams of carbohydrates, and 1 gram of fat. If we also plug in 1 fruit, that's going to give us the other 15 grams of carbohydrates. And we could plug in 2 fats. And now that's the 10 out of the 11 grams of fat. So that candy bar, even though it's not a fruit, even though it's not a starch, and it's not an oil, it's meeting those numbers, okay? So that's what you're going to have to do for some additional plugins. What I found challenging about the food exchange, being a bodybuilder and being a person that eats foods that don't really fall within the food exchange very well at all, even like, for example, like for dairy, I consume Fairlife milk, which has like 12 or 13 grams of protein per serving, and only 6 grams of carbohydrate, compared to regular milk, which has 8 grams of protein and 12 grams of carbohydrate. So that's kind of hard to work into this food exchange. Or the whey protein. I mean, whey is actually dairy, but a lot of people consume whey protein that has no carbohydrates in it. So that doesn't really fall within this food exchange. So I created what's called the macronutrient exchange. So basically, we're using the same process of the food exchange, only now we've got some room for some foods that do not really fall within the guidelines of the food exchange, like the whey protein or the Fairlife skim milk or Greek yogurt, those types of foods. And what I did to make everything fall into place on this diagram here, which you'll see, is I've set this up to where for every 9 grams of protein, every 9 grams of carbohydrate, we're going to have 1 exchange. While at the same time, for every 4 grams of fat, we're going to have 1 exchange. And the reason that I did that is because there's 4 calories of protein per gram of protein, and same with the carbohydrates, there's 4 calories per gram. While with fat, there's 9 calories per gram. So to make everything really easy mathematically, going by percentages, this macronutrient exchange balances everything out to where it's 1-to-1 basically. So if I say that I want to have 40% protein and 30% carbohydrates and 30% fats, I could just basically go by the grams rather than by the calories. Okay. So if you look at the top of the spreadsheet here, I've listed a 2,000 calorie diet made up of 30% protein, 45% carbohydrate, and 25% fat. So what that breaks down to would be 150 grams of protein and 225 grams of carbohydrates and 55.56 grams of fat, so roughly 56 grams of fat. So if you would divide those grams of protein and those grams of carbohydrates by 9, then that is going to give us the number of exchanges of 16.67 and 25 for the protein and carbohydrates. And if we divide the fat grams by 4, that is going to give us a total of 13.89. So if you're putting together a diet, you figure out how many meals that you're going to have and how many exchanges of each macronutrient that you want to have in each meal, and then start plugging in the foods that fall within those that macronutrient exchange. So I put together a plan that is it's roughly a 40-30-30 plan. It's slightly off a little bit. It's very difficult to make something perfect like that. But it ends up being 41% protein, 28% carbohydrate, and 27% fat. So the goal here for each meal, so when we look at the first meal, was 45 exchanges of protein with 0-to-1 exchanges of carbohydrate and 4-to-5 exchanges of fat. So I found some foods to plug in. I plugged in some omega-3 eggs and some egg beaters mixed together, and some turkey sausage links. So basically we're looking at a high protein, high fat, low carb breakfast to consume. And it ended up having 4.44 total exchanges, which fell within my goal of 4-to-5 exchanges of protein. And the fat exchanges was a total of 5, which was within my 4-to-5 goal. And the carbohydrates at 0.44 exchanges was within the goal of the carbohydrate exchange of 0-to-1. And basically did that for other meals too, with different exchange levels. And that was how I put together this diet to be roughly around 40-30-30 type of diet. If I wanted to go with something different, say maybe 25% protein and 50% carbohydrate, 25% fat, I would have just had to have did some different math on the numbers and come up with some different macronutrient goals per meal, and then plug in the foods that match that. So by following this macronutrient exchange, just like the food exchange, now you've got a little bit of extra variety that you can add to creating your own meal plan. So if you have interest in putting together your own plan, I definitely recommend giving this a try and use the foods that are in the exrx.net to help you figure out how many calories and how many different nutrients such as carbs, proteins, and fats that are in these foods. That concludes this presentation. If you have any questions, please contact me at Eric, it's ERIC, .neal, NEAL, .4 at us.af.mil. Thank you.